There's a medical oath that every doctor takes, a promise to do no harm, to heal the sick, to save lives. But what happens when saving a life means breaking every rule in the book? What happens when the enemy isn't a disease, but your own government? In 1943, in a small town in northern Italy, one doctor faced an impossible choice: follow orders and watch innocent boys march to their deaths, or become a criminal in the eyes of the fascist regime. His name was not written in history books. His story was buried under decades of silence. But what he did in the shadows of war was nothing short of extraordinary. He took healthy young men, boys really, some barely 18 years old, and he broke them. He wrapped their arms in plaster. He encased their legs in casts. He made them invalids, cripples in the eyes of the military inspectors. And by doing so, he saved them from the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, where Mussolini's forces were being slaughtered by the thousands in the frozen hell of the Russian winter. The world knows about the heroes who stormed beaches and flew bombing raids. We remember the generals, the Medal of Honor recipients, the men who charged into machine gun fire. But history forgot the quiet acts of rebellion, the small miracles performed in examination rooms and village clinics. It forgot the doctors who turned their healing hands into instruments of deception, who used their knowledge of the human body not to repair it, but to strategically damage it just enough to fool the system. This is not a story about glory. This is a story about moral courage in its purest, most terrifying form. Because every time this doctor picked up that plaster and wrapped it around a healthy limb, every time he signed a medical exemption form with a fraudulent diagnosis, he wasn't just risking his career. He was risking his life, his family's life, and the lives of everyone in his village who knew what he was doing. Northern Italy in 1943 was a pressure cooker ready to explode. Mussolini's fascist dream was crumbling. The Allies had invaded Sicily. The Italian people were starving, exhausted by 3 years of war that had brought them nothing but grief and coffins draped in the Italian flag. But Il Duce wasn't done. He needed more bodies, more cannon fodder to throw at the Allies in the south and the Soviets in the east. The conscription age kept dropping. First it was 21, then 19, then 18. Soon they were taking boys who had never shaved, boys who still lived with their mothers, boys who had never fired a rifle. In the villages and small towns scattered across the Po Valley and the foothills of the Alps, families lived in terror of the knock on the door, the official letter with the government seal, the summons that meant their son had 72 hours to report to the nearest military depot. The recruitment system was brutal in its efficiency. Every young man of age had to present himself for a medical examination. A military doctor would inspect him, check his reflexes, his eyesight, his teeth like he was livestock at auction. If you were breathing and had 2 working legs, you were fit for service. There were no exemptions for being an only son. There were no exemptions for having a sick mother or a farm that would collapse without you. The only thing that could save you was a legitimate medical condition, something documented, something visible, something the military doctors couldn't dispute: a missing limb, tuberculosis, severe epilepsy, or a broken bone that hadn't healed properly, leaving you permanently disabled. This is where our doctor enters the story, though we must be careful even now, 80 years later, about using his real name. Some secrets remain dangerous. Some truths are still protected by the families who lived them. What we know is this: he was in his late 30s, trained in orthopedics at the University of Bologna, and he had returned to his hometown to practice medicine among the people he had grown up with. He knew every family in the surrounding villages. He had delivered their babies, set their broken bones, sat at their kitchen tables drinking bitter coffee and homemade grappa. And when the war came, when the recruitment officers started arriving with their lists and their quotas, these families came to him with desperate eyes and trembling hands, begging him for the one thing he could give them that no one else could: a way out. The first time he did it, his hands shook so badly he almost couldn't tie the cast properly. The boy was 17, the youngest son of a farmer who had already lost 2 boys at El Alamein in the North African desert. The mother had come to the doctor's office after midnight, when the streets were empty and the blackout curtains were drawn. She didn't need to explain. He saw it in her face, the terror of losing her last child, the willingness to do anything, pay anything, risk anything. The doctor told the boy to lie down on the examination table. He told him this would hurt, that it had to look real, that the military doctors were not fools. Then he took the boy's left arm, positioned it at an unnatural angle, and wrapped it in layer after layer of plaster, creating the perfect illusion of a compound fracture that would take months to heal. When the boy walked out that night with his arm in a sling and tears streaming down his face from the pain of an injury that didn't exist, the doctor sat alone in his office and wondered if he had just committed the bravest or most cowardly act of his life. Word spread the way secrets always spread in small Italian villages, whispered over clotheslines and muttered in church pews, passed from desperate mother to desperate mother like contraband. Within weeks, the doctor's waiting room began filling with young men who arrived after dark, who entered through the back door, who paid in whatever they had, a wheel of cheese, a bottle of preserved tomatoes, a chicken, sometimes nothing at all. The doctor never refused anyone. He never asked for money. He understood that what he was doing transcended economics. This was about blood, about soil, about keeping the sons of Italy alive, when their own government seemed determined to waste them in wars that served no purpose but the ego of a dictator who modeled himself after Caesar but lacked even a fraction of Caesar's military genius. The technique evolved with practice. The doctor learned that a broken arm was easier to fake than a broken leg, because the patient could still walk into the examination center under their own power. He discovered that the most convincing injuries were the ones that looked catastrophic, but would theoretically heal with time, giving the military doctors no reason to suspect permanent malingering. He became an artist of medical fraud, studying the exact angle at which a fractured radius presented on an X-ray, memorizing the swelling patterns of genuine trauma so he could replicate them with strategic padding beneath the plaster. He kept meticulous false records, backdating injuries to weeks before the recruitment notice arrived, creating paper trails that could withstand scrutiny. Every detail mattered. One mistake, one inconsistency, and the entire operation would collapse. But northern Italy in 1943 was not just dealing with conscription. The country was fracturing along political lines that would soon explode into civil war. In July of that year, Mussolini was overthrown by his own Grand Council and arrested. For 45 days, Italy dared to hope that the war might be over, that peace might be possible. Then Hitler sent German paratroopers to rescue Mussolini from his mountain prison, and the nightmare deepened. Mussolini established a puppet government in the north called the Italian Social Republic, but everyone knew who really controlled it: the Nazis. The SS moved into Italian towns. The Gestapo set up headquarters in commandeered villas, and the hunt for deserters, draft dodgers, and anyone who resisted the new order became vicious. The German occupation changed everything. The military medical examinations became more thorough, more suspicious. German doctors began accompanying the Italian recruitment officers, men trained to spot deception, men who had seen every trick in the book from German draft dodgers, and who assumed Italian boys would try the same schemes. They brought portable X-ray machines to some examination centers. They demanded second opinions. They interviewed family members separately to check for inconsistencies in stories. The stakes had been high before. Now they were lethal. Getting caught helping someone avoid conscription wasn't just a crime anymore. It was treason against the Reich. The punishment was execution, usually carried out immediately, often in the town square as an example to others. The doctor knew the walls were closing in. He heard stories from other towns, whispers of physicians arrested, of clinics raided in the middle of the night, of medical records seized and examined for patterns that suggested systematic fraud. Some doctors stopped taking the risk. They turned away the desperate families, told them there was nothing they could do, advised them to send their sons to report as ordered. But our doctor couldn't stop. Every time he considered ending the operation, another mother would appear at his door with that look in her eyes, that look that said her son was all she had left in the world. And he would prepare another cast, craft another false diagnosis, and add another name to the invisible list of young men he had saved from the machinery of death. The process became a ritual of carefully choreographed deception. Each young man who came to the doctor had to be coached, trained like an actor preparing for the performance of his life. They had to learn how to wince at the right moment when the examiner touched the cast. They had to remember the exact date of the supposed accident, the exact circumstances, whether they had fallen from a ladder or been kicked by a horse or crashed a bicycle on a mountain road. The stories had to be mundane enough to be believable, but dramatic enough to justify the severity of the injury. The doctor would spend hours with each patient, drilling them on their backstory, testing them with unexpected questions, preparing them for the interrogation they would face at the recruitment center. Because the German doctors were not just checking bones, they were checking souls, looking for the telltale signs of fear and dishonesty that marked a faker from a genuine invalid. The physical toll of the fake injuries was something the doctor hadn't fully anticipated. Keeping a healthy limb immobilized in plaster for weeks or months was not without consequences. The muscles atrophied. The skin grew pale and thin. The joint stiffened from disuse. When the casts finally came off after the immediate danger of conscription had passed, some of the young men found themselves genuinely impaired, needing weeks of rehabilitation to regain full function. The doctor agonized over this. He was causing real harm to prevent hypothetical harm, trading certain pain for uncertain survival. But then he would hear news from the front, reports of entire Italian divisions wiped out in Yugoslavia, of transport ships sunk in the Mediterranean with thousands of conscripts drowning in the dark water, and he knew that temporary disability was a small price to pay compared to a funeral and a folded flag. The resistance movement was growing stronger across northern Italy, and the doctor found himself drawn into their network, not as a fighter, but as a facilitator. Partisan leaders began sending people to him, young men who had already deserted from the army and needed documentation to explain their absence, to give them cover stories if they were stopped at a checkpoint. The doctor created medical histories out of thin air, forged hospital discharge papers, even convinced a sympathetic pharmacist to backdate prescriptions for medications that would support his false diagnoses. He was building an entire architecture of lies, a parallel medical reality that existed only on paper, but that could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of young men who refused to fight for a regime they despised. The paranoia became unbearable. Every knock on the door made his heart race. Every stranger in the village square seemed like a potential informant. The fascist regime had cultivated a culture of betrayal, where neighbors reported neighbors, where children were encouraged to inform on their own parents if they spoke against Mussolini. The doctor knew that all it would take was one person, one disgruntled patient or one zealous blackshirt, to bring everything crashing down. He started sleeping in his clothes, keeping a small bag packed with essentials hidden under his bed, in case he needed to flee in the middle of the night. He burned his most incriminating records, committing names and dates to memory instead, turning himself into a living archive of his own crimes. But even as the danger intensified, even as German soldiers patrolled the streets and SS officers requisitioned homes and executed suspected partisans in public, the doctor continued his work. The mothers kept coming. The sons kept arriving with desperate eyes and trembling hands, and the doctor kept breaking the oath he had sworn to do no harm, kept inflicting calculated injuries on healthy young bodies, kept gambling his life and his family's life on the belief that some rules are meant to be broken when the alternative is complicity in mass murder. He had crossed a line that most physicians would never dare to cross, and there was no going back. He was committed now, fully and irrevocably, to this quiet war of medical resistance. By the winter of 1943, the doctor had developed a network that extended beyond his own village. Other physicians, priests, and even a few sympathetic local officials had quietly joined the conspiracy. They created an underground railroad of sorts, where young men could be shuffled between towns, their medical records following them, their injuries documented by multiple sources to create an unassailable paper trail. A boy who received his cast in one village would get his follow-up examination in another. His x-rays taken in a third location, all coordinated to make it appear as though multiple independent medical professionals had confirmed the severity of his condition. The beauty of this system was its redundancy. Even if one doctor was arrested, even if one set of records was seized, the others could corroborate the story. The Germans would have to prove a conspiracy that spanned multiple towns and involved dozens of people. a nearly impossible task in a region where loyalty to the regime was already threadbare. The winter brought new challenges that the doctor hadn't foreseen. The cold made the plaster casts more uncomfortable, more painful, and some of the young men began to crack under the strain. One boy, barely 19, showed up at the doctor's office in the middle of the night, begging to have his cast removed early. He couldn't sleep, he said. The itching was driving him mad. His mother was suspicious. His friends were asking questions. The doctor refused. He explained with brutal honesty that premature removal would invalidate the entire deception, that the boy would be called back for re-examination, that the military doctors would smell the fraud immediately. The boy left angry, resentful, but the cast stayed on. 2 weeks later, the doctor learned that the boy's best friend, who had reported for duty as ordered, had been killed in a training accident before he even reached the front. The friend had been 18 years old, had never fired a shot in combat, had died when a truck carrying recruits skidded on ice and plunged into a ravine. When the boy with the fake cast heard the news, he came back to the doctor's office and wept, and thanked him, and never complained about the itching again. The moral calculations became increasingly complex. The doctor wasn't just saving individual lives anymore. He was making choices about who deserved to be saved and who didn't. Families with connections, with resources, with the knowledge that this option even existed, they came to him first. But what about the poorest families, the ones who didn't know that help was available, the ones who suffered in silence and sent their sons to war because they believed there was no alternative? The doctor tried to spread the word discreetly, tried to reach out to the most vulnerable families through trusted intermediaries, but he knew he couldn't save everyone. The guilt ate at him. Every time he learned that another local boy had been killed at the front, he wondered if that boy had ever heard about the doctor who could make injuries appear, if that boy's family had been too proud or too frightened to ask for help. The German occupation forces were tightening their grip on daily life throughout northern Italy. Curfews were enforced with lethal force. Food rations were cut to near starvation levels. Random searches became routine, with soldiers bursting into homes without warning to look for weapons, contraband, or evidence of resistance activity. The doctor's office was searched twice in the span of 3 weeks. The first time, the Germans were looking for medical supplies they suspected were being diverted to partisan fighters in the mountains. The second time, they were looking for hidden Jews, as the roundups had begun in earnest and any home could be sheltering refugees. Both times the doctor stood by calmly, his false records hidden in plain sight among thousands of legitimate patient files, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might be visible through his shirt. Both times, the Germans found nothing suspicious and left. But the message was clear. No one was safe, no place was sacred, and the net was tightening. The psychological toll on the doctor was immense. He stopped sleeping through the night. He developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking his records, obsessively verifying that every date aligned, that every signature was consistent, that there were no gaps or inconsistencies that could raise suspicion. He avoided social gatherings where people might ask too many questions. He became paranoid about who knew what, constantly worried that his network was too large, that too many people were aware of what he was doing, that someone would talk under torture or would betray him for a reward. The fascist government had begun offering bounties for information leading to the arrest of resistance members and their collaborators. The price on a doctor who was systematically defrauding the military conscription system would be substantial. Every conversation felt like a potential trap. Every patient felt like a potential informant. Trust became the scarcest commodity in a world where betrayal meant survival. The spring of 1944 brought a turning point that no one had anticipated. The Allies were advancing up the Italian peninsula, liberating town after town, pushing the Germans northward in a grinding, brutal campaign that left entire villages destroyed and thousands of civilians dead in the crossfire. But liberation was still months away for northern Italy, and in the meantime the desperation of the fascist regime reached new heights. Mussolini's puppet government began conducting forced roundups, sending trucks through villages in the middle of the night to grab any young man they could find, regardless of whether he had been officially conscripted or not. The standard medical exemptions no longer mattered. Boys with documented injuries were being taken anyway, told they could serve in support roles, told they could work in factories producing weapons, told anything to get them into the trucks. The system the doctor had so carefully constructed was collapsing because the regime had stopped following its own rules. The doctor realized he needed to escalate his methods. Simple broken bones were no longer enough. He began creating more severe, more permanent-looking injuries. He developed a technique for inducing temporary paralysis in a limb by carefully applying pressure to specific nerve clusters, then documenting the condition as permanent nerve damage from trauma. He coached young men on how to fake seizures convincingly, then diagnosed them with epilepsy severe enough to make them unemployable for any military purpose. He even resorted to deliberately infecting minor wounds to create visible suppurating injuries that would horrify any examiner. These were desperate measures, dangerous both medically and legally, but the alternative was watching boys being dragged away at gunpoint to serve a regime that was clearly in its death throes, throwing away young lives in a futile attempt to delay the inevitable defeat. The resistance fighters in the mountains were becoming bolder, launching attacks on German convoys and assassinating local fascist officials. The reprisals were savage. For every German soldier killed, the Nazis executed 10 Italian civilians, chosen at random from the local population. The doctor treated the survivors of these massacres, the wounded who had been left for dead, and each one reinforced his conviction that what he was doing was not just justified, but necessary. These were not abstract moral questions anymore. This was a clear choice between complicity and resistance, between saving lives and preserving a corrupt system. The Hippocratic Oath said do no harm, but what greater harm could there be than allowing young men to be fed into a war machine that served no purpose but the vanity of tyrants? The network of collaborating physicians began to fracture under the pressure. One doctor in a neighboring town was arrested after a patient under interrogation revealed that his injury had been fabricated. The doctor was tortured for 3 days to extract the names of others involved in the conspiracy, but he gave up nothing. On the 4th day, he was hanged in the town square, his body left dangling from a lamppost as a warning. The message was received. 2 other doctors immediately ceased all activities related to fake medical exemptions. They burned their records, destroyed their correspondence, and refused to see any more young men seeking help. The doctor couldn't blame them. They had families, children, lives they wanted to preserve. But their withdrawal meant that more desperate families were now coming to him, that the burden was concentrating on fewer and fewer people willing to take the risk. The strain on the doctor's own family was becoming unbearable. His wife knew what he was doing, had known from the beginning, but the constant fear was destroying her health. She had developed an ulcer from the stress. She jumped at every sound. She couldn't eat or sleep properly. His teenage daughter had figured out the truth by piecing together overheard conversations and late-night visitors, and now she lived in terror that her father would be arrested, that she would watch him executed like the doctor in the neighboring town. The doctor considered stopping, considered telling the next desperate mother who appeared at his door that he simply couldn't help anymore, that the risk had become too great. But every time he came close to making that decision, he would think about the faces of the boys he had already saved, boys who were still alive because of what he had done, and he knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance to save even one more life. The breakthrough that saved the operation came from an unexpected source, a sympathetic German medical officer who had grown disillusioned with the Nazi regime. He was an older man, a career military doctor, who had served in the First World War and who viewed the current conflict with cynicism and barely concealed contempt. He had been assigned to oversee medical examinations in the region, and he had begun to notice patterns in the documentation, clusters of similar injuries in specific towns, fractures that seemed statistically improbable in their frequency and timing. But instead of reporting his suspicions to his superiors, he did something remarkable. He sought out the doctor privately, met him in a church under the pretense of seeking medical advice for a personal ailment, and told him that he understood what was happening and that he would not interfere. More than that, he would actively help by approving questionable cases and steering more aggressive German investigators toward other regions. His only request was that the doctor be more careful, that the injuries be more varied. that the paper trail be cleaner. He couldn't protect them forever, he said, but he could buy them time. This unexpected alliance transformed the operation. With a German officer providing cover, the doctor could work more openly, could take on more cases, could expand the network to include even riskier candidates. Young men who had already been called up for duty, but had fled and were hiding in barns and cellars, could now resurface with backdated medical documentation that explained their absence. Deserters who faced execution if caught could be given legitimate medical histories that transformed them from criminals into invalids. The scope of what was possible expanded dramatically, and with it, the number of lives saved multiplied. But the doctor knew this reprieve was temporary. The German officer was nearing retirement age, and there were rumors he would soon be replaced by a younger, more fanatical SS doctor who would show no mercy to anyone suspected of undermining the war effort. The summer of 1944 brought news that electrified the resistance. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The invasion of France meant that Germany was now fighting a two-front war, that resources would be diverted away from Italy, that the end might actually be in sight. But it also meant that the Germans would become more brutal in their efforts to maintain control over northern Italy, more willing to resort to terror tactics to prevent the population from rising up. The doctor witnessed this firsthand when German troops burned an entire village to the ground after weapons were discovered hidden in a church. Every man over the age of 15 was executed. The women and children were left to wander the countryside with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The message was clear: resistance would be met with annihilation. The doctor's own moment of greatest danger came in late August. A young fascist official, ambitious and eager to prove his loyalty to the regime, had been conducting his own investigation into irregularities in medical exemptions. He had compiled a list of doctors whose patients showed suspicious patterns, and the doctor's name was at the top. The official appeared at the clinic unannounced with 2 armed black shirts and demanded to see all medical records from the past 18 months. The doctor had no choice but to comply. He led them to his filing room, his mind racing through calculations of what they might find, which cases might appear suspicious, whether the altered dates and forged signatures would withstand scrutiny. The official spent 3 hours going through files, asking pointed questions, taking notes. The doctor answered each question with practiced calm, providing medical explanations for every anomaly, citing standard orthopedic protocols, never wavering in his performance. Finally, the official closed the last file, looked the doctor in the eye, and said he would be conducting follow-up interviews with several patients to verify their stories. The next 72 hours were the longest of the doctor's life. He couldn't warn the patients without exposing himself. He couldn't flee without abandoning his family and confirming his guilt. He could only wait and hope that the young men he had coached so carefully would remember their training, would stick to their stories, would withstand interrogation by a suspicious official looking for any inconsistency. On the 3rd day, word came through the network. The fascist official had been killed by partisan fighters while traveling to conduct his interviews. His vehicle had been ambushed on a mountain road, and he and his black shirt escorts had been executed. The investigation died with him. The doctor's records were returned to his office unopened. He had been saved not by his own cleverness or by divine intervention, but by the violent resistance of men who killed to protect the network of deception that kept their brothers and sons alive. The autumn of 1944 marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini's puppet regime, but it was also the most dangerous period for anyone involved in resistance activities. The Germans knew they were losing Italy, and they responded with a scorched earth mentality, determined to extract maximum value from the region before retreating northward. Forced labor conscription intensified beyond anything seen before. Young men were no longer being recruited just for military service, but for work battalions that would build fortifications, dig trenches, and serve as human shields during retreats. The medical exemptions that had once been respected were now routinely ignored. German officers would arrive at hospitals and clinics, review the lists of men classified as unfit for service, and simply declare them fit enough for labor duty. The doctor watched in horror as several of his patients, young men with legitimate casts and documented injuries, were dragged from their homes and forced onto trucks headed for the Austrian border, where massive defensive works were being constructed in anticipation of the Allied advance. The doctor realized that his careful system of fake injuries was becoming obsolete, that the regime had abandoned even the pretense of following medical protocols. He made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a year earlier. He would need to make some of his patients genuinely, visibly, undeniably disabled in ways that even the most brutal labor conscription officer couldn't ignore. He began performing minor but permanent procedures, small surgeries that would leave visible scarring and functional impairment. He would make precise incisions on tendons that would heal poorly, creating permanent weakness in a hand or foot. He would remove small sections of bone that would cause a limp that could never be fully corrected. These were not life-threatening injuries, but they were irreversible, and they transformed healthy young men into people who could legitimately claim disability. Each time he performed one of these procedures, he felt like he was betraying everything he had been trained to do, but he also knew that a permanent limp was better than death in a forced labor camp or execution as a deserter. The Allied advance had stalled south of Florence, bogged down by German defensive lines and brutal winter weather. Northern Italy would not be liberated for many more months, which meant the doctor would have to continue his operation through another winter of occupation, another season of fear and deprivation and constant danger. Food was becoming scarce even for those with money. The Germans were requisitioning everything they could carry, leaving the civilian population to survive on whatever scraps remained. The doctor often went hungry so that his supplies of plaster and medical materials wouldn't run out. He bartered with farmers for raw materials, trading his services for the gypsum and cloth he needed to continue making casts. Every resource was precious. Every decision was a calculation of competing needs and limited options. The network of resistance-supporting physicians had been reduced to just a handful of people still willing to operate. Most had either been arrested, had fled to the mountains to join the partisans, or had simply stopped out of self-preservation. The doctor found himself almost alone, fielding requests from an ever-widening area as desperate families traveled from villages dozens of miles away seeking his help. He was exhausted, running on fear and adrenaline, and the grim determination that had sustained him for more than a year. His hands shook when he applied the casts now, not from nervousness, but from malnutrition and lack of sleep. His wife begged him to stop, to flee with her and their daughter to Switzerland where they might find refuge, but he refused. There were still boys to save, still families depending on him, still a few more months before liberation might come. The German medical officer who had been protecting him was transferred away in November, replaced by exactly the kind of fanatical young SS doctor they had feared. This new officer was efficient, ruthless, and deeply suspicious of the high rate of medical exemptions in the region. He announced that all previous exemptions would be reviewed, that new examinations would be conducted under direct German supervision, and that any doctor found to have issued fraudulent medical certificates would be subject to immediate military tribunal and execution. The walls were closing in. The doctor knew that his time was running out, that the protection he had enjoyed was gone, and that his next fake diagnosis might be his last. But even knowing this, even understanding that he was likely walking toward his own destruction, he couldn't stop. 3 more boys came to him in the first week of December. 3 more casts were applied, 3 more lives were saved, and 3 more crimes were added to the invisible ledger that would either condemn him or redeem him, depending on who won the war. The crisis came on a frozen morning in mid-December when the new SS medical officer arrived at the clinic with a full detachment of soldiers and announced a complete audit of all medical records dating back 2 years. This was not a random inspection. This was a targeted investigation, and the doctor knew immediately that someone had talked, that his name had been given up under interrogation or sold for a reward. The SS officer was methodical and unhurried, going through files with the precision of a man who had done this before, who knew exactly what patterns to look for, what inconsistencies would reveal fraud. He pulled aside dozens of files, stacking them on the doctor's own desk, cases involving young men of military age with conveniently timed injuries that had kept them out of service. He asked the doctor to explain the statistical anomaly of so many orthopedic injuries in such a small area. He asked why the doctor's patients seemed to recover so slowly compared to patients treated by other physicians in the region. Each question was a trap, each answer scrutinized for hesitation or contradiction. The doctor maintained his composure through 3 hours of interrogation, providing technical explanations, citing medical literature, attributing the patterns to local factors like poor nutrition, affecting bone healing, and the mountainous terrain leading to more accidents. But he could see in the SS officer's eyes that none of it was working, that the man had already made up his mind and was simply building a case that would justify the arrest he intended to make. Then the officer did something unexpected. He demanded that the doctor accompany him to conduct physical re-examinations of 10 patients selected at random from the suspicious files. They would visit these patients unannounced, remove their casts if necessary, and verify whether the injuries were genuine. If even one case proved to be fraudulent, the officer said, the doctor would be arrested immediately and the patients would face charges of desertion and conspiracy. The doctor had no choice but to agree, knowing that at least half of the 10 names on the list were young men with completely fabricated injuries. The first 3 home visits revealed nothing incriminating, because those patients happened to have genuine injuries that the doctor had legitimately treated. But the 4th name on the list belonged to a boy whose arm had been perfectly healthy when the doctor had encased it in plaster 6 weeks earlier. As they drove to the farmhouse where the boy lived with his family, the doctor's mind raced through scenarios, trying to think of some way to warn the boy, some signal he could give that would prepare him for what was coming. But the SS officer kept the doctor in his sight at all times, clearly anticipating any attempt at communication. When they arrived at the farmhouse and the officer ordered the boy to present himself, the doctor saw raw terror in the young man's eyes. The officer demanded that the cast be removed immediately so he could examine the injury. The doctor had no tools with him, no saw to cut through the plaster. The officer didn't care. He ordered one of his soldiers to smash the cast with the butt of a rifle. What happened next was something the doctor would remember for the rest of his life. As the soldier raised his rifle to strike the cast, the boy's mother rushed forward screaming that they couldn't hurt her son, that he was all she had, that his father and brothers were already dead. She threw herself at the soldier with such force that she knocked him off balance. In the chaos that followed, the boy broke free and ran, sprinting across the frozen fields toward the tree line where he might disappear into the forest. The SS officer drew his pistol and fired 3 times. The first shot missed. The second shot hit the boy in the leg, sending him tumbling into the snow. The third shot never came because the mother had grabbed the officer's arm, clawing at him, screaming curses in dialect. The officer struck her in the face with his pistol, knocking her unconscious, then turned to his soldiers and ordered them to retrieve the boy. They dragged him back, bleeding and sobbing, and forced him to sit on the frozen ground while they smashed the cast with their rifle butts. When the plaster fell away, it revealed an arm that was pink and healthy, slightly atrophied from weeks of immobilization, but showing no signs of any fracture, no bruising, no swelling, nothing that would indicate a genuine injury. The SS officer turned to the doctor with a look of cold satisfaction and said simply that the audit was over, that he had seen enough, and that the doctor would be placed under arrest pending a full investigation and military tribunal. The soldiers bound the doctor's hands with wire and forced him into their vehicle. As they drove away, the doctor looked back through the rear window and saw the boy still sitting in the snow, his mother kneeling beside him, trying to stop the bleeding from his leg wound, both of them destroyed by the exposure of a secret that had been meant to save a life, but had instead condemned 2 people and revealed a conspiracy that would likely lead to dozens more arrests. The doctor had always known this moment would come, had prepared himself mentally for capture and possibly execution, but nothing had prepared him for the crushing guilt of knowing that his actions had brought suffering to the very people he had tried to protect. The doctor was taken to a converted villa on the outskirts of town that the SS had turned into an interrogation center, a place whispered about in terrified voices, a place where people went in and rarely came out whole. He was thrown into a cellar room with stone walls slick with moisture and a single barred window near the ceiling that let in pale winter light. For 2 days, he was left alone with nothing but a bucket and his own thoughts, a calculated technique designed to break down psychological defenses before interrogation even began. He knew what was coming. He had treated enough resistance fighters to know the methods the Germans used, the progression from questions to threats, to physical torture. He made a decision during those 2 days of solitude. He would confess to everything, take full responsibility, but he would give up no names. Not the families who had come to him for help, not the other doctors in the network, not the German medical officer who had protected him, and especially not the young men he had saved. He would claim he had acted alone, that the families had been deceived, that they had believed their son's injuries were genuine. It was a thin story, unlikely to be believed, but it was the only protection he could offer. The interrogation began on the 3rd day, and it was worse than he had imagined. The SS officer who conducted it was not interested in building a case or extracting information. He was interested in punishment, in making an example, in satisfying his own sadism under the cover of official duty. The questions were perfunctory, almost an afterthought to the real purpose of the sessions. They wanted him to suffer, to scream, to beg. They wanted to break him so completely that when they hanged him in the public square, he would serve as a warning to anyone else who thought they could undermine German authority. The doctor tried to maintain his dignity, tried to hold on to the conviction that what he had done was right, but pain has a way of reducing even the strongest person to nothing more than a body begging for mercy. By the 4th day, he had lost track of time, couldn't distinguish between the interrogation sessions and the fever dreams that came between them. He confessed to crimes he hadn't committed, implicated people who didn't exist, said anything they wanted to hear just to make it stop for a few hours. But then something extraordinary happened. On what the doctor later learned was the 6th day of his captivity, partisan fighters launched a coordinated attack on the town. They had received intelligence about the interrogation center and the prisoners being held there, and they mounted a raid specifically designed to liberate them before they could be executed or transported to concentration camps in Germany. The attack came at dawn, with explosives breaching the villa's walls and partisan fighters pouring through the gaps firing weapons they had captured from German convoys. The SS guards were caught completely unprepared, many of them still asleep when the assault began. In the chaos and confusion, the partisans fought their way to the cellar, smashing open the locked doors and pulling out prisoners who could barely walk. The doctor was carried out on the shoulders of 2 young resistance fighters, one of whom he dimly recognized as a patient he had treated months earlier for a broken collarbone, a real injury, not a fake one, sustained during a training exercise with captured weapons in the mountains. The partisans retreated to the forests above the town, taking their liberated prisoners with them. The doctor spent 2 weeks recovering in a partisan camp, hidden in caves and rough shelters, built from pine branches and stolen canvas. He was cared for by a resistance medic who had minimal training but boundless determination, a young woman who kept him alive through the worst of his injuries and the infection that followed. Slowly, painfully, he began to heal. His body mended faster than his spirit. He had nightmares about the interrogation, about the moment the cast had been smashed and his patient's secret exposed, about the mother's face as the SS officer struck her. He learned that the boy with the fake arm injury had survived his leg wound, but had been arrested and was being held somewhere, destination unknown. The boy's mother had been released after questioning, but their farmhouse had been burned as collective punishment. The doctor had tried to save lives, and instead he had brought destruction. As winter turned toward spring and the Allied advance finally resumed, the doctor remained with the partisans, serving as their medical officer, treating wounds sustained in ambushes and skirmishes, performing emergency surgeries in caves with inadequate supplies and no anesthesia beyond homemade grappa. He was no longer saving young men from conscription. He was trying to keep fighters alive long enough to see liberation, trying to stitch together bodies torn apart by German bullets and shrapnel. It was honest work, unambiguous work, and in some ways it was easier than what he had done before because there was no deception involved, no moral grey areas, just the simple equation of wounded fighters who needed care. But he never forgot the young men he had saved with his fake casts and forged documents, never stopped wondering whether they had survived, whether his network had been fully exposed, whether more families had suffered because of his exposure. Liberation finally came to northern Italy in April of 1945, when Allied forces broke through the last German defensive lines and partisan uprisings erupted in cities and towns across the region. The doctor walked out of the mountains with the partisan brigade, returning to a world transformed by violence and exhausted by years of suffering. His clinic had been ransacked by retreating German forces. His medical records, the careful documentation he had maintained for years, had been seized or destroyed. His home was still standing, but had been occupied by fascist officials who had fled just hours before the partisans arrived. His wife and daughter had survived, hidden by sympathetic neighbors, but they were malnourished and traumatized. The reunion was joyful but muted, shadowed by all they had lost and all they had endured. The doctor himself was a changed man, thinner, older, marked by scars both visible and invisible. The torture had left permanent damage to his hands, a cruel irony for a man whose livelihood depended on precision and dexterity. In the weeks after liberation, the doctor began to learn the fate of the young men he had tried to save. Some had survived the war, their fake injuries having kept them out of combat or forced labor. They came to thank him, bringing gifts of food and wine, offering to help rebuild his clinic, calling him a hero. But others had not been so fortunate. Several had been caught after his arrest, their fraudulent medical exemptions exposed during the investigation that followed. Some had been executed as deserters, others had been sent to labor camps in Germany and had not returned, presumed dead in the final chaotic months of the war. The boy whose fake cast had been smashed had survived his imprisonment and came to the doctor's clinic, walking with a pronounced limp from his bullet wound. A genuine disability now, one inflicted by the very system the doctor had tried to circumvent. The boy bore no grudge. He thanked the doctor for trying, told him that his mother had also survived, that they were rebuilding their farm. But the encounter left the doctor hollow with guilt and grief. The official record of what the doctor did during the war years was deliberately obscured. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, when emotions ran high and vengeance was often swift and brutal, the doctor made a conscious choice not to publicize his role. He feared that if word spread about how many young men he had helped avoid military service, there would be accusations that he had undermined the Italian war effort, that he had been a traitor rather than a hero. The political situation was complicated and dangerous. Former fascists were being executed in the streets. Collaborators were being dragged from their homes. The line between resistance and cowardice was being drawn by angry mobs rather than thoughtful tribunals. So the doctor said nothing. He accepted no recognition, gave no interviews, filed no official reports about his activities. The few people who knew the full truth kept silent out of respect for his wishes. The story was buried under the rubble of war, forgotten in the celebration of liberation and the hard work of reconstruction. For decades, the story remained hidden. The doctor returned to practicing medicine, treating the broken bodies and traumatized minds of a population that had endured occupation, civil war, and famine. He never spoke publicly about what he had done, not even to his own children when they were old enough to understand. Some of the young men he had saved went on to become teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, fathers, and grandfathers. They lived ordinary lives, unremarkable lives, precisely the kind of lives the doctor had fought to preserve. They carried the secret with them, understanding instinctively that their survival had come at great cost to others, that the doctor's sacrifice and suffering had purchased their futures. It was only after the doctor's death in the 1970s that a few of these men, now elderly themselves, began to share their stories with historians and journalists who were documenting previously unknown acts of resistance during the war. The doctor's story matters because it reveals a truth about moral courage that is often overlooked in our worship of conventional heroes. We celebrate the soldiers who stormed beaches and the resistance fighters who planted bombs, but we forget the quiet acts of civil disobedience performed by ordinary professionals who used their skills and positions to undermine unjust systems. The doctor broke his oath to do no harm by inflicting calculated injuries on healthy young men, but in doing so, he prevented far greater harm. He violated the laws of a fascist regime to honor a higher law, the fundamental human obligation to preserve life when governments demand death. His story was buried not because it was shameful, but because it was dangerous, because it challenged the neat categories of patriotism and duty that nations use to justify sending young men to war. Even now, 80 years later, We struggle to fully acknowledge the moral complexity of what he did, the impossible choices he faced, and the price he paid for choosing compassion over compliance. But his legacy lives on in the descendants of the young men he saved, in the families that exist because one doctor decided that some rules are worth breaking when the alternative is complicity and murder.